Hey there. Welcome to Lurkbound. I'm so glad you're here. There's something about the quiet parts of the world, the places people don't usually look, that holds the most chilling secrets. Tonight, I've put together a collection of true accounts that prove sometimes the things we fear aren't just in our heads. They're out there, waiting in the silence. I'm always curious to see how far these stories travel, so definitely let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. And if you're a fan of these kinds of stories, feel free to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to support what I do here. Now, make sure your doors are locked, settle in, and let's see what's lurking in the dark. I was only about 13 years old when my parents left me home alone overnight for the very first time. Up until then, the longest I had ever been by myself was maybe a few hours after school, so this felt huge. To my parents, it was probably a small step toward independence. To me, it felt like I had been handed the keys to the world. The house was mine for the night, and there was no way I was going to waste that freedom by doing something boring like sleeping. As any 13-year-old would, I made a whole plan in my head. I was going to stay up all night, no bedtime, no lights out, no one telling me to turn the TV down or stop playing games. I had snacks ready, my phone charged, Netflix lined up, and that special mix of excitement and nervous energy buzzing through me. The house felt different without my parents in it. Quieter, but also bigger, like every room suddenly mattered more because I was the only one in it. The night started off exactly how I imagined. I bounced between watching shows, scrolling on my phone, and wandering around the house just because I could. Every sound made me pause for a second, but I brushed it off. Old houses make noise, pipes creak, the wind moves things around. I told myself I wasn't scared, just alert. I felt proud of myself for handling it so well. By the time it hit around 2 in the morning, the excitement had dulled into that strange late-night calm where everything feels slightly unreal. The house was completely dark except for the glow of the TV and my phone screen. That's when I heard it. At first, it was just some rustling coming from the backyard. Leaves shifting. A faint movement sound. And my heart jumped straight into my throat. Every scary movie I had ever seen flashed through my mind all at once. Someone creeping around outside, someone watching the house, someone knowing I was alone. For a few seconds, I just froze. Then I forced myself to calm down. I told myself I was being dramatic. We lived in an area where rabbits and other small animals weren't uncommon. It was way more reasonable to assume it was just an animal passing through than anything else. I actually laughed a little at myself for getting so worked up. I turned my attention back to Netflix and tried to relax. A few minutes later, I heard another sound. This one was different. It wasn't random rustling. It wasn't the soft movement of an animal. It was deliberate, metallic, subtle, but intentional. And that's when it hit me how unlikely it was that a rabbit was down there messing with the lock on our back door. That calm confidence vanished instantly. My heart started pounding again, but this time it was heavier, slower, and way more serious. I muted the TV and held my breath, listening. There it was again. A quiet scrape, a small click. Someone was trying to do something with the door. I moved slowly, trying not to make any noise, and went to my parents' bedroom because their window had the best view of the backyard. I remember my hands shaking as I pulled the curtain back just enough to look outside. What I saw made my stomach drop. There was a man kneeling right there at our back door. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light, a real person. He was down on his knees, working carefully at the lock. I'll give him this much credit. He was actually being pretty quiet. If Netflix hadn't been buffering earlier, I might not have heard him at all. He clearly knew what he was doing, or at least thought he did. For a moment, I felt pure fear. the kind that makes your whole body go cold. I was 13. My parents were gone. There was a grown man actively trying to break into my house. Every warning my parents had ever given me about strangers, safety, and staying inside suddenly felt very real. But then something else kicked in. Instead of panicking the way I probably should have, my brain took a sharp turn into stupid teenage confidence. I don't know if it was adrenaline, pride, or just being young and dumb, but part of me started to feel bold, reckless even. I wasn't thinking about calling the police. I wasn't thinking about hiding. I was thinking about doing something. At that time, we had 2 massive German shepherds. Each one was around 90 pounds, solid muscle, sharp ears, and intimidating even to people who loved dogs. They weren't just big either. They were trained, well trained. They listened, and more importantly, they could be quiet when told to be quiet. I looked back out the window at the guy. He wasn't very big. I'd guess around 5'7", maybe shorter, and definitely not bulky. He didn't look like someone ready to fight 2 huge dogs. That realization changed everything in my head. I called the dogs over quietly and gave them the command to stay silent. To their credit, they immediately switched modes. No barking, no growling, just alert, focused, and ready. Seeing them like that gave me a surge of confidence that, looking back, I probably didn't deserve. So I waited. I waited far longer than I should have, honestly. I crouched there, watching this guy work at the lock, heart racing, dogs tense at my side. Every second felt stretched. At some point, I started to feel almost annoyed, like, come on, man, either do it or don't. I remember thinking how anticlimactic it was to be waiting so long after all that build-up. After about 20 minutes, the lock finally gave way. The back door creaked open, and that's when everything happened at once. I released the dogs. I have never seen a human being move that fast in my entire life. The moment the door opened and those 2 German shepherds exploded into motion, the guy didn't even hesitate. He bolted. Full sprint. No looking back. No second thoughts. Just pure survival instinct kicking in. The dogs chased him across the yard, barking like thunder, closing the distance in seconds. I stood there, heart pounding, watching him disappear into the darkness beyond our property line. If there had been a camera recording it, I swear it would have been the funniest, most satisfying video ever made. I would honestly pay good money to see that footage. After it was over, the dogs came back like nothing had happened, tails wagging, proud of themselves. I locked the door, checked every window twice, and finally sat down, shaking with leftover adrenaline. It took a while for my heartbeat to slow down. Looking back now, I know there were about 1 million smarter ways to handle that situation. I could have called the police immediately. I could have hidden. I could have turned on all the lights and made noise to scare him off. I could have done literally anything that involved less risk, but I didn't. And strangely enough, I don't regret it. That night taught me a lot. It showed me how fast fear can turn into action, how confidence can be misplaced, and how luck plays a bigger role than we like to admit. It also showed me the power of having loyal dogs who are ready to protect their home without hesitation. Most of all, it left me with a memory I'll never forget. The kind of story you tell years later, shaking your head at your younger self, half embarrassed and half impressed. I laughed harder that night than I probably ever should have, mostly from the sheer release of tension and disbelief that it had actually worked. And I can say with absolute certainty that whoever that guy was, he never came back. Not to our house, not to our yard, probably not to any place guarded by 2 massive German shepherds. No regrets. It happened in the late 1970s, and even now, decades later, the memory still sits heavy in my chest. I sometimes tell myself that at least the man involved is probably dead by now, simply because of the passage of time. That thought doesn't bring comfort exactly, but it does put some distance between then and now. Still, when I think back on it, I can feel the same unease creeping up my spine, the same instinctive dread that told me something was very wrong long before my mind fully understood it. At the time, my husband and I were living in a modest house, nothing fancy, just a normal place where we expected normal problems. One of those problems started small and strange. Every now and then, when I used the stove, I would feel a mild electric shock. It wasn't strong enough to knock me back or burn me, but it was enough to make me jump and swear under my breath. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe it was static electricity. Maybe it was the dry air. But it kept happening, and after a while, it was impossible to ignore. We talked about it, and my husband decided we should call an electrician. He worked long hours, and the only time someone could come out was during the day while he was at work. I didn't love the idea of being alone with a stranger in the house, but this was the 70s, and you didn't think twice about these things back then. People trusted professionals. You assumed someone doing a job like that was safe, normal, and there to help. The electrician arrived in a large van that I remember clearly even now. It was one of those boxy work vans common at the time, dull-colored, unremarkable. Ain't the kind you'd see parked on any street. The man who stepped out of it, though, was anything but unremarkable. He was huge, at least 6'5", maybe taller. He seemed to fill the doorway when I opened the door for him, his shoulders broad, his presence overwhelming in a way that immediately made me feel smaller than I already was. He didn't smile much. He wasn't rude exactly, but there was something off about him from the beginning. His eyes lingered too long. His voice was calm in a way that felt practiced, not natural. Still, I told myself I was being silly. He was just a big guy. Not everyone is warm or friendly. I let him in and showed him to the basement where the fuse box was. He went downstairs while I stayed at the top of the steps at first, listening to the sounds of metal and tools. Eventually he called me down, saying he needed to check something. I remember hesitating, my hand resting on the railing before forcing myself to go down. The basement was dim and cool, the kind of place where sounds echo just a little too much. He took the cover off the fuse box and poked around for a while. He frowned, muttered to himself, checked wires, and tested things. After some time, he straightened up and said he couldn't find anything wrong. According to him, everything looked fine. No loose wires, no obvious faults. Nothing that would explain why I was getting shocked. Then he said something that caught me completely off guard. He told me I should avoid wearing nylon panties when using the stove. I remember blinking at him, unsure if I'd heard correctly. It felt inappropriate, strange, and dismissive all at once. As if the problem wasn't the wiring or the appliance, but me, my clothing, my body. I laughed weakly because I didn't know what else to do. He said it casually, like it was perfectly normal advice, and then moved on, as if nothing odd had been said. That should have been the end of it. He could have packed up his tools, replaced the fuse box cover, and left. But instead, he stayed, and he started talking. At first it seemed like aimless chatter, just someone filling the silence. Then the subject of his conversation shifted, slowly, almost lazily, into something deeply unsettling. He began talking about a man who had recently been caught by the police. His voice dropped, becoming quieter, more thoughtful, as if he were sharing something profound. He said this man had been found with a woman's genitals in a plastic bag in his pocket. I remember my stomach tightening instantly. The words didn't even feel real as they left his mouth. They hung in the air between us, ugly and horrifying. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't want to respond. I just stood there, frozen, my mind scrambling to understand why an electrician, standing alone with a woman in her basement, would choose that topic of conversation. He kept going. In a soft, almost reflective tone, he said, I guess you can't really know anyone until you've walked a mile in their shoes." As he said it, he lifted his electric drill and pointed it directly at my stomach. Time seemed to slow down in that moment. I became painfully aware of how alone I was, how far away my husband was, how no one could hear me if I screamed. My thoughts raced, but my body wouldn't move. I felt like prey caught in a spotlight, waiting for something terrible to happen. His eyes weren't wild. That was the worst part. They were calm, distant, like he was lost in his own thoughts, enjoying them. The drill hummed faintly, a quiet, mechanical sound that felt impossibly loud in the silence of the basement. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. He seemed to snap out of whatever mental place he had drifted into. His posture relaxed. He lowered the drill. His voice returned to normal. He looked at me as if nothing unusual had occurred and asked, "You want me to put the cover back on the fuse box?" I don't remember exactly what I said. Something polite, something automatic. I do remember thinking very clearly that I wanted him out of my house as fast as possible. I told him no, thank you, that it was fine, that he could go. He didn't argue. He gathered his things, walked up the stairs, and left. I locked the door behind him and stood there for a long time, shaking. I didn't even realize how badly my hands were trembling until I tried to make myself a cup of tea and nearly dropped the mug. When my husband came home, I told him everything, every word, every detail. The look on his face shifted from confusion to anger to fear as I spoke. He wanted to call the company immediately to report the man, but at the time, we didn't even know what to say. Nothing had technically happened. No crime had been committed. And in those days, people didn't take things like this as seriously as they should have. We made a decision not long after that. We moved. It wasn't just because of that incident, but it played a big part. I never felt safe in that house again. Every noise made me jump. Every knock at the door made my heart race. I needed distance, not just physically, but mentally. A new place felt like a fresh start. 3 years passed. Life went on. The fear dulled, though it never completely disappeared. Then one day, I looked out the window and saw that same van parked outside our house. For a moment, I thought I must be mistaken. Surely it couldn't be the same one. But I knew. I recognized it instantly. The shape, the color, the way it sat at the curb. I felt sick. I don't know if he knew we lived there. I don't know if it was a coincidence. I don't know if he even remembered me. All I knew was that I wasn't going to be alone that day. My husband stayed home from work. He didn't leave my side. We watched that van until it eventually drove away. Nothing happened. No one knocked on the door. No one came inside. But the damage was already done. The sense of safety we had rebuilt cracked all over again. Even now, all these years later, I think about how close something terrible might have come to happening, how easily it could have gone another way, how instincts, quiet and subtle, can sometimes save you when logic tells you everything should be fine. I trust those instincts now. I never ignore them, because that day taught me something I've never forgotten. Sometimes the danger isn't loud or obvious. Sometimes it's soft-spoken, standing right in front of you, holding a drill and smiling like nothing is wrong. My friend told me this story years ago, and even now, whenever he brings it up, his voice changes slightly, like he's being pulled back into that moment, whether he wants to or not. It didn't happen to me directly, but hearing it from someone I trust, someone who isn't dramatic or attention-seeking, made it stick with me in a way that's hard to shake. This wasn't a story he enjoyed telling. It was something that clearly left a mark on him and on his family. At the time, he was still in school, living with his parents and 2 sisters in a fairly ordinary house. Nothing about the place stood out. It wasn't old or run down, and it didn't have any obvious creepy history that they knew of. It was just a normal family home in a normal neighborhood. His parents both worked, so during the school year, well, the kids often came home to an empty house in the afternoons. Because of that, each of them had their own key. Whoever got home first would unlock the door, go inside, and wait for the others. On this particular day, my friend came home earlier than usual. He clearly remembers checking the time because it felt strange to be home so early. When he unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the house was quiet in that way only an empty house can be. No TV noise, no voices, no movement. He assumed no one else had arrived yet, especially not his sisters, who usually came home later than he did. He dropped his bag, sat down for a bit, and tried to relax. Everything felt normal at first. After a few minutes, though, a small thought crossed his mind, the kind of thought you don't really question. He wondered if he had closed the front door properly. Sometimes it wouldn't latch all the way unless you pushed it just right. It wasn't fear that made him get up, just habit. He didn't want one of his parents coming home later and getting annoyed that the door had been left unlocked. So he stood up and walked toward the front of the house. The hallway stretched out in front of him, quiet and dim, with rooms branching off on either side. As he reached the door and checked the lock, he turned around to head back into the house. That's when he saw someone sitting at the far end of the hallway. At first, his brain did what brains usually do. It tried to make sense of it quickly, using the easiest explanation available. He assumed it was his sister. She was sitting on the floor, facing away from him, her back slightly hunched. She was wearing the same clothes she had been wearing the night before, the ones she slept in. Her hair looked messy, tangled, like she had just rolled out of bed. That alone struck him as a little odd. She normally changed clothes in the morning and never sat on the hallway floor like that. Still, siblings do weird things sometimes, and he didn't immediately panic. He started walking toward her, calling her name. Once, then again, no response. He remembers feeling slightly annoyed at first, thinking she was ignoring him on purpose. As he got closer, he noticed she hadn't moved at all. She didn't shift her position, didn't turn her head, didn't react in any way to his voice. He called her name again, louder this time, asking if she was okay, asking why she was sitting on the floor. The closer he got, the more something felt wrong. It wasn't just the silence. It was the way the figure felt empty somehow, like it didn't belong there. He slowed down, his steps becoming hesitant. Then he noticed something that made his stomach drop. He couldn't see her face. Her head was angled in such a way that it should have been visible as he approached, but it wasn't. It wasn't shadowed or turned away naturally. It was simply not there in the way it should have been. His brain struggled to process it. For a split second he thought maybe the lighting was playing tricks on him. Maybe his eyes hadn't adjusted properly, but instinct kicked in before logic could catch up. Fear hit him hard and fast, like a switch being flipped. He didn't try to speak again. He didn't try to touch her. He turned around and ran. He ran out the front door, sobbing, barely able to breathe, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of his chest. Outside, he nearly collided with his other sister, who had just arrived home. She was confused and alarmed by his state. He was crying uncontrollably, trying to explain through gasps what he had seen. To her, it sounded impossible. She thought he must have imagined it, or made it up, or scared himself somehow. He begged her not to go inside, but she didn't believe him. After a few minutes, she convinced him to go back in with her. They stood at the doorway together, hesitating before stepping inside. The house was still quiet. The hallway was still there, stretching out in front of them exactly as before. And the figure was still there. This time they both saw it. They both froze, their fear sinking instantly, Whatever doubt his sister had vanished the moment she laid eyes on it. They didn't try to approach it. They didn't speak. They screamed and ran out of the house together, clutching each other as they fled. They went straight to a neighbor's house and stayed there, shaking and crying until their older sister came home. Even then, none of them wanted to go back inside. They waited together until their parents returned from work. When they told them what had happened, the adults tried to stay calm, tried to rationalize it, but the fear in their children was undeniable. That house never felt the same again. The family didn't stay long after that, not because they had proof of anything supernatural, not because something else happened that could be pointed to clearly, but because the sense of safety was gone. Once that feeling disappears, it's incredibly hard to get back. Every shadow feels wrong. Every quiet moment feels watched. Every hallway feels longer than it should be. They moved out not long after. My friend doesn't like to speculate about what it was. He doesn't call it a ghost outright, and he doesn't try to explain it away either. He just knows what he saw, and more importantly, what his sister saw too. Two people seeing the same impossible thing at the same time is hard to dismiss, no matter how much you want to. What unsettles me the most about his story isn't the image itself, though that's terrifying enough. It's the familiarity of it. Whatever they saw chose to look like someone they loved. It sat in their hallway, in their home, wearing clothes from the night before, waiting quietly. There was no noise, no warning, no dramatic entrance. Just a presence that didn't belong, pretending it did. And maybe that's what makes it linger in the mind. Not the fear of something unknown, but the fear of something that looks known, something that wears the shape of family, and waits for you to get close enough to realize it never was. That night started out calm in a very specific, very familiar way. I was in my bedroom, completely relaxed, wearing noise-canceling headphones, listening to music, drinking beer, and smoking weed. The kind of night where your body feels heavy and your thoughts feel slow and comfortable. All the lights in the apartment were off except for the small lamp in my bedroom, which cast a soft, warm glow over my desk. From where I was sitting, I could see straight down the hallway into the living room, which was completely dark. I was drawing, fully absorbed in it, the way you get when time sort of stops mattering. The music filled my head, blocking out everything else, and I felt isolated from the rest of the apartment in a peaceful way. That's probably why it took me a second to register that something felt off. Through the music, or faint and distant, I thought I heard the front door close. I paused my drawing and lifted my head slightly, listening harder. The hallway was still dark. No lights turned on. No footsteps followed. Nothing moved. I stared down the hall for a moment, trying to decide if I had actually heard something or if my brain had just made it up. Between the weed, the alcohol, and the headphones, it seemed completely reasonable that I was imagining things. Must be imagining it, I thought. So I shook it off, lowered my head, and went back to drawing. A minute or two passed, maybe less. Then I heard something else. This time it was much closer. The bathroom door, right outside my bedroom, closed. And when I looked up again, the bathroom light was on. That got my attention. I took my headphones off and listened. I assumed it was my roommate. Nothing about the situation felt threatening yet. People come home quietly sometimes. Maybe they didn't want to turn on the main lights. Maybe they were trying not to wake anyone. It wasn't unusual enough to set off alarms in my head. Then I heard the toilet flush. Then footsteps. Then the bathroom door opened. I waited to see someone pass by my doorway or turn on a light in the living room. Nothing happened. The apartment stayed dark, except for the bathroom light and my bedroom lamp. Whoever it was moved through the space without turning on a single light. and that was when my curiosity started to shift into unease. Something about that felt wrong. I sat there for a moment, listening carefully. I could hear faint movement, the kind of sound you only notice when you're paying attention. Cabinets, maybe. A shuffle. Soft footsteps. Whoever it was seemed very comfortable moving around in the dark. That's when I decided I needed to see what was going on. I reached for a flashlight and stood up slowly, suddenly very aware of how quiet everything was. The music was off now. The room felt different, without it, heavier. I stepped out of my bedroom and into the hallway, keeping the flashlight pointed downward at first. As I rounded the corner toward the kitchen, I noticed a faint glow coming from ahead. It wasn't from any of my lights. It was an iPhone screen. The kitchen was barely illuminated by that pale, bluish light, and standing there, facing my refrigerator, was a person I did not recognize. They opened the fridge like they belonged there, casually, like this was the most normal thing in the world. My heart jumped, but my voice came out surprisingly steady. "Oh, hello?" The guy nearly jumped out of his skin. He spun around so fast I thought he might drop whatever he was holding. I flicked on the overhead light, and suddenly everything was painfully clear. Standing in my kitchen was a man a couple of inches shorter than me, and I'm already not very tall. He was wearing a button-down shirt and a newsy cap, looking completely out of place and absolutely terrified. For a split second, we just stared at each other. Then he spoke, rushed and nervous. "Hey, I'm Dave's friend. He said I could sleep on the couch." My brain stalled. "There's no Dave who lives here," I said slowly. He blinked, hard. Dave, you know, your roommate." "I don't have a roommate named Dave," I replied. "Where are you trying to go?" His face drained of color. Oh my God," he muttered, or looking around like the walls themselves had betrayed him. "Is this address number for the next building over?" "No," I said. "Sorry, man." That's when it really hit him. Oh my God, you're so nice about this," he said, spiraling immediately. "Oh my God, I let myself in, and I used your bathroom, and I put my In-N-Out in your fridge. Do you want some In-N-Out?" I stared at him, trying to process the fact that a complete stranger had entered my apartment, used my bathroom, and stored his food in my refrigerator, and was now offering to share it like this was a minor social mix-up. "Now, I'm okay," I said. "You just got to go one building over." He looked mortified. "I'm so sorry. I'm so embarrassed. You're so nice about this." "You're all good," I said, honestly meaning it. And then I walked him to the door and showed him out. The moment the door closed behind him, the apartment felt very quiet again. Too quiet. I stood there for a minute staring at the door, replaying everything that had just happened. The fear came late, creeping in after the fact. For a brief moment, my hands actually shook. I realized how differently that situation could have gone. A stranger had walked into my home. At night, while I was distracted, high, and wearing noise-cancelling headphones. For a minute, I felt a real jolt of vulnerability, the kind that makes your stomach drop when you realize how exposed you actually were. I think the weed is what kept me calm in the moment. My reaction had been strangely measured, almost casual, like my brain refused to fully panic. But once the adrenaline wore off, the absurdity of it all settled in. When I opened my fridge afterward and saw a bag of In-N-Out sitting there, I actually laughed. It felt unreal, like a weird dream logic moment that made no sense in the context of real life. For a second, it genuinely felt like Jiminy Cricket had popped out of my refrigerator and tried to crash on my couch. Nothing else happened that night. No further scares, no more unexpected visitors. But the experience stuck with me. It was funny in hindsight, sure, but it was also unsettling in a quiet way, a reminder of how thin the line is between calm and chaos, between safety and surprise. One moment, I was just drawing in my room, lost in music and my own head. The next, I was accidentally hosting a very polite, very embarrassed stranger who took a wrong turn and ended up in my life for about 5 surreal minutes. And honestly, I don't think I'll ever open my fridge at night without half expecting another confused man in a newsy cap offering me fast food. I was very young when it happened, young enough that most of my memories from that time feel blurry and dreamlike. But this night is different. This night stayed with me. Even now, when I think back on it, I can still feel the strange mix of fear, confusion, and safety all tangled together. At the time, I didn't fully understand what danger really was. I only knew that something bad had happened while I was asleep, and that the people and the dog who loved me had protected me without hesitation. Back then, our house felt big to me. The hallways seemed long, the rooms felt deep and quiet at night, and every small sound echoed. My sister had already moved out by then, starting her own life somewhere else. My parents both worked night shifts, so it wasn't unusual for them to be gone after dark. My brothers were older than me and had their own lives too. Sometimes they were home, sometimes they weren't. That night, they had gone out, leaving me alone in the house. To me, it didn't feel strange. It was normal. I was a kid, and kids trust their world to stay the way it is when they close their eyes. I remember going to sleep in my parents' bedroom. It was the room that felt the safest. Their bed was familiar, the smell of their blankets was comforting, and the walls felt like they held everything together. I fell asleep without worry, without fear, without any idea that strangers would soon be inside the same house. While I slept, people I didn't know were moving through the rooms, opening doors, touching things that didn't belong to them. That thought alone feels heavy now, but back then I was completely unaware. At some point during the night, my brothers came back home. I wasn't awake to see it, but later I was told what happened. When they pulled up and walked toward the house, something immediately felt wrong. The front door was open, not cracked, not unlocked, open. The kind of open that tells you something isn't right before you even step inside. The air felt wrong. The silence felt different. They didn't stop to think too long. Fear has a way of making decisions fast. They rushed inside, calling out, hearts pounding, knowing our parents weren't home and knowing that I was somewhere inside. The house was dark, but they could tell something had happened. Things were out of place. The feeling in the air was tense, like the house itself was holding its breath. They ran straight to my parents' room, where I was sleeping. I was still asleep when they reached me. I imagined them seeing me there, small and unaware, while knowing that the people who broke in were still upstairs. That thought alone makes my chest feel tight. They didn't waste time. One of them scooped me up, holding me close, and they carried me out of the house as fast and quietly as they could. Every step mattered. Every sound felt dangerous. Later, we would realize just how close the danger had been. The people who broke in were still upstairs, while my brothers were inside. We were in the same house at the same time, separated by walls, floors, and luck. If things had gone differently, if timing had been off by even a minute, the story could have ended another way. What truly protected me that night, though, was our dog. We had an old Chow Chow and Rottweiler mix. He wasn't young anymore. His movements were slower, his face showed his age, but his loyalty was as strong as ever. He had always been protective of the family, especially of me. That night, while I slept, he stood his ground. The hallway leading to my parents' room told the story. There were blood splatters along the walls and floor. There was blood leading toward the stairs. It was clear that someone had tried to get past him and failed. Our dog had defended that hallway, defending the room where I slept, refusing to let anyone through. He didn't run. He didn't back down. He did what he believed was his job. When my family saw him later, he was alive. He was okay, considering what he had faced. He had some burnt hair, which always stood out as a strange detail. It suggested that the people who broke in may have tried to scare or hurt him with fire. But that detail alone still gives me chills. The fact that someone knew about his fear of fire made the situation even more unsettling. Because of that, my family began to suspect that the break-in wasn't random. It felt personal. Only a few people knew about the dog's fear. Only people close to us would know the house well enough to move through it so confidently. There was a quiet fear that it could have been someone familiar, maybe a friend of my brother's, someone who had been inside our home before, someone who knew our routines. After my brothers carried me out of the house, they didn't stop until we reached a neighbor's place. The safety of another home, another set of walls, felt like a lifeline. I was awake by then, confused, scared, clinging to them without fully understanding why my heart was racing. Adults were talking quickly, or phones were being used. Doors were being locked. By the time the police arrived, the people who broke in were gone. They had disappeared into the night, leaving behind fear, blood, and questions that would never fully be answered. There were no clear faces, no solid names, no closure. Just the knowledge that they had been there and that they had left. As I grew older, the memory changed shape. As a child, it was just a scary story that people told around me. As an adult, it became something heavier. I began to understand how close I had been to real danger. I understood what my brothers had risked by going inside. I understood what our dog had done, standing alone in a dark hallway against strangers who meant harm. That night taught me something I didn't have words for back then. It taught me that safety is fragile. It taught me that love often shows itself in silent, instinctive actions. My brothers didn't hesitate. Our dog didn't hesitate. They protected me without thinking about themselves. Even now, I sometimes think about how different things could have been. I think about how I slept through something that could have changed my life forever. I think about how loyalty, courage, and timing all came together in a way that allowed me to grow up and tell this story instead of being lost inside it. The house itself never felt quite the same after that. Even when nothing was wrong, there was a quiet awareness that something had once crossed a line there. But life moves on. People move out, grow up, move away. The memory stays, tucked away, resurfacing now and then like a reminder. Most of all, I remember the dog. Old, brave, loyal. A silent guardian in the dark. He didn't get a medal or recognition. He just did what he knew how to do. And because of him, because of my brothers, because of a few moments of courage and luck, I was safe. That night could have been a tragedy. Instead, it became a story of protection, instinct, and survival. One that still lives with me long after the blood was cleaned, the doors were fixed, and the strangers disappeared into the dark. I was home alone that night, and it felt strangely peaceful in the beginning. My husband was away on a trip, and instead of feeling lonely, I was actually enjoying having the house to myself. Our home is an old place, built sometime in the 1940s, the kind of house that creaks a little at night and has doors and floors that tell you they've been around a long time. I had my usual nighttime routine going. I turned my white noise up high, put on my sleep mask, and let myself fully relax. There was nothing weighing on my mind. I felt safe, comfortable, and completely ready to sleep. I don't remember drifting off. One moment I was aware of the sound of the white noise and the softness of the bed, and the next I was gone. Deep, heavy sleep, the kind where your body fully lets go. That's why what happened next felt so violent and unreal, like being ripped out of a dream and thrown straight into a nightmare. At around 3 in the morning, I woke up to screaming, not distant screaming, not something muffled or far away. It was right there, loud and raw. At the same time, there was kicking, hard, desperate kicking, slamming into my front door. For a few seconds, my brain couldn't catch up. I didn't know where I was or what was happening. The white noise was still playing, my sleep mask was still on, and my heart was suddenly pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I ripped the mask off and sat straight up in bed. The screaming continued. Someone was yelling words I couldn't fully understand, mixed with sobbing and shouting. The door shook with each kick. I was instantly terrified. My husband wasn't home. It was the middle of the night, and someone was trying to get into my house. My first instinct was to call 911. I grabbed my phone, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold onto it. I tried to unlock it, but my fingers kept slipping. I dropped the phone once, then again. Each time it hit the floor, my panic got worse. I could hear the door being kicked over and over, and all I could think was that I didn't have much time. This was an old house. The door was old too. I didn't trust it to hold forever. My mind started racing through worst-case scenarios. I imagined the door splintering, someone bursting inside, and me being trapped with nowhere to go. I felt completely exposed, alone, vulnerable. The fear was so intense it felt physical, like something pressing down on my chest. At some point, instinct took over. I stopped trying to call and went straight for the handgun my husband and I kept in the house. I had never wanted to use it. I had never imagined needing it. But in that moment, it felt like the only thing standing between me and something terrible. My hands were still shaking as I held it, and I remember thinking how surreal it felt to be standing in my own house, in the dark, gripping a weapon, listening to someone scream on the other side of my door. I moved slowly toward the front of the house. Every step felt heavy. The screaming hadn't stopped. The kicking continued, but it sounded more frantic than aggressive, like pure desperation rather than anger. Still, I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that someone wanted in. When I reached the front door, I stayed behind it for a moment, breathing hard, trying to steady myself. My heart was racing so fast I thought I might pass out. I called out, asking who it was, telling them to stop. The response was more crying, more yelling, words tumbling out in a way that didn't fully make sense. Finally, I opened the door just enough to see what was happening, keeping my distance and staying alert. What I saw stopped me cold. Standing on my porch was a young woman, maybe in her early 20s. She looked completely wrecked. Her hair was messy, her clothes were dirty, and she was barely able to stand upright. She was crying hard, the kind of crying that comes from being totally overwhelmed and broken down. Her feet were covered in cuts, and there was blood everywhere. It was smeared across my porch, splashed on the door, and tracked around where she had been pacing and stumbling. She didn't look dangerous. She looked lost. As the adrenaline slowly shifted into shock, I realized she was drunk. Not just tipsy, not just buzzed, completely blacked out drunk. She could barely focus her eyes. Her words slurred together. She kept apologizing, then crying, then apologizing again. Between sobs, she explained what had happened. She was 23 years old. She had been out downtown with her husband. They got into some kind of fight, and he left her there. No ride, no phone, no wallet. Somehow, in her state, she decided to walk. She walked 3 miles from downtown to my house, 3 miles, in the middle of the night, drunk, barefoot, and bleeding. To this day, I don't know why she chose my house. She couldn't explain it either. She just kept saying she needed help and didn't know where else to go. Once I understood what was going on, the fear began to drain out of me, replaced by something else entirely. Concern, shock, a strange sense of responsibility. I put the gun away and focused on her. She wasn't a threat. She was a mess. A scared, hurt, Very young woman who had been abandoned and didn't know what to do. She didn't have her phone or her wallet, so there was no way for her to call anyone herself. I brought her some water and a small snack, guiding her to sit down on the porch. She winced every time she moved her feet. The cuts looked painful and the blood was still fresh. I didn't have supplies to properly clean her up, but at least I could get her to sit still. I asked if there was anyone I could call. Through tears and hiccups, she gave me her mother's number. I called and explained the situation as calmly as I could. Her mom sounded worried, but grateful. She said she would come right away. While we waited, the night felt unreal. The screaming had stopped. The chaos had quieted. Now it was just the two of us sitting on my porch in the early morning hours, the air cool and still, the world asleep around us. It felt like we were in some strange bubble, cut off from everything else. She started talking a lot, about her marriage, about how unhappy she was, about how she was thinking about divorcing her husband. The words poured out of her like she had been holding them in for too long. I listened. I nodded. I didn't judge. I just let her talk while she sipped water and tried to calm down. There was something incredibly surreal about it. Just an hour earlier, I had been dead asleep, completely relaxed. Now I was sitting on my porch with a bleeding, drunk stranger, listening to her pour her heart out about her failing marriage. It felt like something out of a movie or a dream that didn't quite make sense. About 30 minutes later, headlights pulled up. Her mum got out of the car, clearly worried and relieved at the same time. She thanked me over and over again. She helped her daughter into the car, apologizing for the trouble, for the mess, for the fear she had caused. I told her it was okay, that everyone was safe. That was all that mattered. And then they were gone. Just like that. The porch was quiet again. The street was empty. The blood was still there, drying in dark patches. I stood there for a moment, trying to process everything that had just happened. It felt impossible that the house could return to silence so quickly after all that noise and fear. I went back inside, locked the door, and finally sat down. My hands were still shaking, but now it wasn't from fear. It was from the crash after the adrenaline, the delayed realization of how intense the situation had been. I cleaned up as best as I could and eventually crawled back into bed, though sleep didn't come easily after that. I never heard from them again. No follow-up, no message, no update. Just that one strange night that dropped into my life and then disappeared. Even now, when I think about it, it feels surreal, terrifying and oddly human at the same time, a reminder of how quickly ordinary moments can turn into something unforgettable, and how sometimes the scariest situations don't end the way you expect them to. I went to bed that night like I always did, without thinking much of anything. My house has a strange layout, but I've lived with it long enough that it feels normal to me. The stairs lead straight up into my bedroom. There is no door at the top, no hallway, no landing that gives you a sense of separation. The staircase simply opens into my room, as if the house decided that privacy was optional. From where my bed is placed, I can only see the very top edge of the stairs. The rest of them disappear downward into darkness, out of sight, like a throat swallowing the lower part of the house. Along the stairs, there are 3 small motion sensor LED lights. They aren't bright, and they don't stay on for long. They're just there to help guide footsteps at night. The lowest one is near the bottom of the staircase. The second one sits around the middle, and the third is closer to the top, though not quite where I can fully see it from my bed. I've gotten used to them turning on when I go downstairs for water or when I come back up half asleep. Their glow is soft and white, nothing dramatic. Most nights, I barely notice them at all. That night, though, something pulled me out of sleep without warning. It wasn't a noise I could immediately identify, and it wasn't a dream either. It was more like the feeling of being watched, or the sudden awareness that something had changed. My eyes opened, and I lay there still for a moment, staring into the familiar shapes of my room. The walls looked the same. The shadows were where they always were. My breathing sounded loud in my own ears, like it always does when you wake up suddenly in the dark. I shifted slightly in bed and glanced toward the stairs, more out of habit than fear. That's when I noticed it. The lowest motion sensor light, the one closest to the bottom of the staircase, suddenly turned on. It wasn't gradual. It just snapped to life, casting a faint glow upward. I froze, my body going completely still. A second later, I heard the stairs creak. My stairs have a sound. I know exactly how they creak when someone steps on them. I know which boards complain and which ones stay quiet. This wasn't a random house noise. It wasn't the settling of wood or a distant pipe. It was the clear, unmistakable sound of weight being placed on a step. I held my breath without meaning to. Before I could fully process what was happening, the second light turned on. It lit up the middle section of the stairs, just high enough that I could see the edge of the glow from my bed. Again, the stairs creaked, slow and deliberate, like someone taking their time. My heart started to race. I remember thinking that it had to be someone breaking in, even though the idea didn't make sense. I hadn't heard a door open, I hadn't heard glass break, and yet the lights were reacting exactly the way they always did when a person walked up the stairs. Step, light, creak, another step, another light. I swallowed hard and called out, "Hello!" My voice sounded strange to me, thinner than usual, like it didn't fully belong in the room. The word echoed slightly and then disappeared into the quiet. For a moment, everything stopped. The lights stayed on, but there were no more sounds. No footsteps, no creaking, just silence. That minute felt longer than it probably was. I lay there staring at the top of the stairs, my eyes wide, my body tense. I was listening so hard that my ears almost hurt. I tried to tell myself that maybe it was a glitch. Maybe the lights were faulty. Maybe the house was just being a house. But deep down, none of those explanations felt right. The timing had been too perfect, too intentional. Then, slowly, the stairs creaked again. This time, though, it was different. I could tell immediately that the sound was moving in the opposite direction. The weight was shifting downward, away from my room, not toward it. The lights didn't turn on again. Instead, one by one, they shut off as the motion sensors timed out. The glow faded from the stairs, leaving the darkness to fill the space again. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't even blink. I just lay there, listening to the last faint creak fade into silence. When everything was finally still, the room felt colder somehow, even though the temperature hadn't changed. My skin prickled, and I had the overwhelming urge to pull the blanket up over my head, like a child trying to hide from something unseen. I stayed in bed for a long time after that. I don't know how long exactly. Minutes, maybe longer. My thoughts kept looping back to the same questions. Who could have been in my house? Why would they come up the stairs and then turn around? Why didn't they say anything when I called out? And if it wasn't a person, then what was it? Eventually, I forced myself to sit up. My heart was still pounding, but curiosity and fear mixed together until I couldn't stand staying still anymore. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness as I slowly stood up and walked toward the top of the stairs. I leaned forward just enough to look down. The staircase was empty. Every step was exactly as it should be. No shadows moved. No lights turned on. The house was silent, in that deep, sleeping way that makes every small sound feel louder than it should. I went back downstairs and checked every door and window. The front door was locked. The back door was locked. Every window was shut and secure. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing was out of place. There were no signs that anyone had been inside the house at all. When I finally returned to my bedroom, I didn't feel relieved. If anything, I felt more unsettled than before. The logical explanations didn't bring comfort. They only raised more questions. If no one had been inside, then what had triggered the lights? What had made the stairs creak so clearly, so deliberately? I lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound made me tense. Every shift of the house made my heart jump. I kept my eyes on the top of the stairs until exhaustion finally dragged me under. Even now, when I think about that night, I still can't explain it. The memory stays sharp in my mind, not because of what I saw, but because of what I heard and felt. The certainty that something was there, moving with purpose, responding to my presence, and then leaving without a trace. The stairs haven't sounded the same since, and every time one of those motion sensor lights turns on at night, I feel that same tight knot of fear form in my chest, reminding me that some things don't need to be seen to be terrifying. I was around 10 years old when one of the creepiest moments of my childhood happened. My older brother and I were home alone that evening, sitting on the couch and watching TV while our parents were out. It wasn't unusual for us to be left alone for a few hours, and at first everything felt completely normal. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you notice every small sound, but we were used to it. Then, out of nowhere, we heard footsteps upstairs. They weren't faint or distant. They were clear and steady, moving across the floor above us like someone was walking from one room to another. My brother and I both froze and slowly turned to look at each other. Neither of us said anything at first. The TV kept playing, but suddenly it felt way too loud in the silence of the house. My brother finally broke the silence and asked, Are Mom and Dad home?" The question made my stomach tighten. We both knew they weren't supposed to be back yet. Still, neither of us wanted to panic, so we shrugged it off. Old houses make noise, right? Floors creak. Maybe it was the house settling, or maybe we were just imagining it. We tried to convince ourselves it was nothing and went back to watching TV, though neither of us was really paying attention anymore. An hour or two later, the tension had faded a little. We started messing around like kids do, chasing each other through the house, laughing and being loud. The fear from earlier felt far away, almost silly. At one point I ran upstairs while my brother stayed at the bottom of the stairs, watching me and joking around. The upstairs hallway was long and narrow. On one side was the master bedroom, and on the other side was the room my brother and I shared, with the bathroom next to it. At the very end of the hallway was my sister's bedroom. The lights were off, and the hallway was dark, stretching out like a tunnel. The only light came faintly from downstairs. I stopped in the middle of the hallway to catch my breath. That's when I turned toward my sister's room. Standing in her doorway was a white figure. It wasn't just a shadow or a quick flash of light. It was full-bodied, shaped like a person, and it seemed to glow faintly, as if it had its own light. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It just stood there, silent and still, like it was watching me. My scream tore out of me before I could even think. Downstairs, my brother flipped the light switch and ran up the stairs as fast as he could. The hallway flooded with light, and when I looked back toward the doorway, the figure was gone. It hadn't walked away or faded slowly. It was just gone, like it had never been there at all. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I could barely breathe, and my legs felt weak. My brother reached me and kept asking what happened, but I could hardly get the words out. I just kept pointing toward my sister's room, shaking. When our parents came home later that night, we told them everything. My dad listened quietly, then went upstairs to check things out. When he came back down, he said he had an explanation. According to him, it was probably just car headlights from outside reflecting off the full-length mirror in my sister's doorway. He said the angle and the light could have made it look like a person was standing there. I didn't believe him. What I saw didn't feel like a reflection or a trick of the light. It felt real. It felt aware, like something that knew I was there and was watching me. But my dad wasn't going to accept any other explanation, and I didn't want to argue, so eventually I stopped talking about it. Years went by, and the memory faded into something I rarely thought about. Then, years later, everything came rushing back. After my parents divorced, my dad moved his new wife and her kids into that same house. One of my stepsisters ended up taking the room that used to belong to my sister, the room at the end of that hallway. One day, she told me something that made my stomach drop. She said that at night, she would hear footsteps pacing back and forth outside her bedroom door. The same kind of footsteps my brother and I had heard when we were kids. Hearing that sent chills through my entire body. It wasn't just a one-time thing. Whatever had been in that house hadn't left. It was still there, still moving through that hallway in the quiet of the night, making its presence known. Even now, when I think back to that night, I can feel exactly how I felt standing in that dark hallway. The fear, the confusion, the certainty that I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a reflection. It wasn't my imagination. And knowing that someone else, years later, heard the same footsteps in the same place only makes it worse. That hallway never really let go of whatever was there. And sometimes I still wonder if it's waiting for someone else to notice it again. I am sorry for the interruption. I hate breaking the flow, but I am curious. Do you believe there is some truth to every story like this? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to hear more, please subscribe. Okay, let's get back to it. A few days ago, I had one of the creepiest experiences of my life, even though I technically wasn't alone. It's the kind of thing that still comes back to me at night when everything is quiet, and the more I think about it, the more unsettled I feel. I'm not someone who scares easily, and I usually try to stay logical about strange things, but this was different. This felt personal, close, and deeply unsettling in a way I still can't fully explain. My friend had asked me to sleep over at her house because she had been feeling uncomfortable there lately. She didn't describe it in dramatic terms, just said that she felt like something was watching her, especially at night. She mentioned it casually at first, but I could tell it was bothering her more than she wanted to admit. I didn't think much of it. I believe in ghosts and things like that, but I'm not afraid of them. I've always thought that fear gives those things power, and I've never had an experience serious enough to change my mind. So when she asked me to stay over, I agreed without hesitation. I thought maybe she was just anxious or stressed, and having someone else there would help her relax. Her house itself wasn't particularly creepy. It was quiet, clean, and felt normal during the day. Nothing felt off when I arrived. We talked, laughed, watched videos, and did all the usual things friends do during a sleepover. As night came, she admitted again that she hadn't been sleeping well, and often woke up feeling watched. I tried to reassure her, joking a bit, telling her that if there was anything weird, I was there and nothing would happen. I truly believed that. Eventually, we went to bed and lay down in the same bed. The room was dark, quiet, and still. I remember thinking how peaceful it seemed compared to the way she had described it. I fell asleep fairly quickly, not expecting anything unusual at all. Almost immediately after falling asleep, I started having very strange nightmares. I can't remember the details now, only the feeling they left behind. They weren't vivid in the way normal dreams are. Instead, they were heavy and suffocating, filled with fear and tension. I remember feeling trapped in them, like no matter what was happening, I couldn't escape the fear. My chest felt tight, even in my sleep, and there was a constant sense that something was wrong. That fear is what eventually woke me up. I woke up suddenly, gasping for air, my heart racing. For a moment I just lay there, trying to calm myself down and remind myself that it was just a nightmare. The room was dark, and my friend was sleeping beside me. I tried to focus on that, on the fact that I wasn't alone, and that nothing bad had actually happened. Then I opened my eyes fully. Standing beside the bed, right next to my friend, was a dark figure. It wasn't solid in the way a person is, but it wasn't transparent either. It was black, darker than the shadows around it, like it absorbed the darkness instead of blending into it. It had a shape that resembled a human, but not clearly enough to identify details like a face or clothing. What terrified me most was its position. It was standing over my friend, and its arm was raised, hovering just above her head, as if it were about to touch her or grab her. The gesture was slow and deliberate, frozen in a moment that felt horribly wrong. My entire body went cold. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just stared at it, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. At first I tried to be logical. I told myself I was still half asleep, that my mind was playing tricks on me after a nightmare. I thought that if I blinked, it would disappear. So I blinked, slowly, carefully. It didn't go away. It was still there, unchanged, unmoving, hovering over my friend as if she were completely unaware of it. That's when real fear set in. This wasn't a dream image fading away. This felt present, real, and intentional. I could feel it in the room, a heavy pressure that made it hard to breathe. I wanted to wake my friend, to shake her, to scream, but fear held me still. I didn't know what would happen if I moved. I didn't know if acknowledging it would make things worse. My mind raced through every possibility, every horror story I had ever heard, every warning about not drawing attention to things you don't understand. In that moment, the only thing I could think to do was pray. I'm not particularly religious, but fear has a way of pushing you toward whatever gives you comfort. I gathered every bit of strength and faith I could find inside myself and started praying silently. I repeated prayers over and over in my head, focusing all my energy on them. I didn't take my eyes off the figure, even though every part of me wanted to look away. The room felt unbearably tense. Time stretched in a way that made seconds feel like minutes. I don't know how long I prayed, but eventually something changed. The heaviness in the room began to lift slightly. The air felt less thick. When I blinked again, the figure was gone. It didn't fade away or move. It was just gone. I lay there shaking, listening to my own breathing, trying to convince myself that I was safe. My friend was still sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of what had happened beside her. I considered waking her up and telling her everything, but I didn't want to scare her. She was already uneasy in that house, and I didn't know how to explain something I barely understood myself. After a long time, when my heart finally slowed down, exhaustion took over and I fell back asleep. The rest of the night was no better. I continued having nightmares, one after another, each filled with the same feeling of fear and helplessness. Even when I slept, it felt like I wasn't truly resting. My body felt tense the entire time, like I was waiting for something to happen again. When morning finally came, I felt completely drained. It was more than just being tired. It felt like my energy had been pulled out of me, leaving me hollow and weak. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was still wrong, even in the daylight. I didn't tell my friend everything. I mentioned that I had slept badly and had some strange dreams, but I left out the details. She already planned to move soon, and part of me felt relieved about that. I knew I wouldn't be staying over again. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't ignore what I had seen or how real it felt. Even now, I don't know what that thing was. I don't know if it was a spirit, a shadow from my subconscious, or something else entirely. All I know is that it felt focused on my friend, like it had been there long before I arrived, and like it didn't want me there. I still believe in staying logical, but some experiences don't fit neatly into logic. They stay with you, sitting quietly in the back of your mind, reminding you that there are things we don't fully understand. And sometimes, believing something exists is very different from seeing it standing inches away from someone you care about, reaching out in the dark. I worked at a small-town pizza shop during my winter breaks in college. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where regulars didn't even need to say their order out loud because we already had it memorized. The shop smelled like dough, garlic butter, and cheap air freshener that tried its best but never quite won. Most nights were slow, especially in winter, so we would stand around wiping counters that were already clean and talking just to pass the time. That's how I got close to a married couple who worked there part-time. They were both in their early 30s, friendly, quiet people who didn't seem like the type to exaggerate or chase attention. They picked up shifts to help with bills, and they treated the job seriously, even though it was just a side thing for them. On late nights when the shop was empty, all the three of us would sit in the back booth and trade stories. Ghost stories, local rumors, weird experiences, anything to keep ourselves entertained until closing. One night, after a long stretch with no customers, the topic drifted to near accidents and close calls. That's when the wife went quiet for a moment. She looked at her husband, and he nodded like he already knew what she was about to say. She told us something had happened just the week before, and even talking about it still made her feel uneasy. She had spent the evening visiting her sister, who lived way out in the country. Not the kind of country where houses are spread out a little, the kind where there are long stretches of road with nothing but trees and open fields. That night, a heavy snowstorm rolled in faster than anyone expected. By the time she decided to head home, the sky had turned thick and grey, and snow was coming down so hard it looked like static on a broken TV. The roads were slick almost immediately. Her headlights barely cut through the storm. Snow piled up faster than the plows could handle, and the painted lines on the road disappeared under a white sheet. She said driving felt like floating in a tunnel with no edges. Every turn of the wheel felt uncertain. The car slid more than it gripped, and her hands were locked tight on the steering wheel the entire time. She debated pulling over, but there was nowhere safe to stop. The shoulders were already buried, and she was afraid of getting stuck in the middle of nowhere with no cell service. So she kept crawling forward, inch by inch, following what she hoped was still the road. At one point, visibility dropped so badly she couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The snowfall thickened, and the world outside her windshield vanished into white. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, red lights exploded in front of her. She didn't see the railroad crossing until the warning lights were already flashing. The gate arm came down so suddenly it almost slammed onto her hood. She screamed and hit the brakes. The tires locked. The car skidded forward in a long, helpless slide. For a split second she was sure she wouldn't stop in time. She could already imagine the train tearing through the storm. Imagine the impact. The car finally jerked to a stop, just inches from the tracks. She said her heart was pounding so hard it hurt. Her breath fogged the inside of the windshield. Then the train came roaring past, louder than anything she had ever heard. It shook the ground, shook the car, shook her bones. Snow blasted sideways in the wind of it. She just sat there frozen, staring at the metal blur until the last car disappeared into the storm. When the crossing gate lifted again, she didn't move right away. She had to force her hands to unclench from the steering wheel. She was shaking so badly she could barely press the gas. The rest of the drive home felt like a dream. Every shadow looked dangerous. Every mile stretched forever. When she finally pulled into her driveway and stepped inside, her husband said she looked pale. She told him everything in a rush: the storm, the slide, how close she had come to the tracks. She kept repeating how the gate had almost smashed her hood. He tried to calm her down, told her she was safe now, that it was over. They stayed up late talking about it. Even hours later, she couldn't stop replaying that moment in her head. The next morning, after the storm had passed, her husband told her he wanted to show her something. He didn't explain what. He just asked her to get in the car. They drove back the same route she had taken the night before. In daylight, the road looked harmless. Snow sat quietly on the fields. The sky was clear, like the storm had never happened. She felt embarrassed telling the story again in her head, wondering if she had overreacted. Then they reached the railroad crossing. Her husband pulled over and parked. She stared out the window, confused. There were no flashing lights, no gate, no warning system at all. Just an old wooden railroad crossing sign, faded and leaning slightly to one side. The kind you see in rural areas that haven't been updated in decades. A passive crossing, no electricity, no arms that came down, nothing that could flash or move or crash onto a car hood. She thought maybe they had the wrong spot. She insisted they drive farther. They went up the road, turned around, came back. It was the only crossing for miles. Her husband got out and walked to the tracks. She followed him, her boots crunching in the snow. There was no sign of recent construction. No broken equipment buried nearby. No wires. No posts where lights might have been removed. The ground was untouched except for snow and old gravel. She stood there staring at that simple wooden sign and felt the same cold fear from the night before crawl back into her chest. She knew what she had seen. She remembered the red lights reflecting off the snow. She remembered the gate arms slamming down. She remembered stopping inches from it. That memory was sharp and clear, not fuzzy like a dream. She could still hear the warning bells in her head, but there was nothing there. They drove home in silence. She kept looking back at the crossing in the side mirror until it disappeared, even telling us the story in the pizza shop. Her voice shook a little. She said she didn't know what scared her more. The idea that her mind invented the entire thing, or the idea that something had appeared there just long enough to stop her from driving onto those tracks at the wrong time. Her husband didn't laugh or argue. He just sat there nodding slowly. He told us he had driven that road for years. That crossing had never had lights, never had a gate, not once. After she finished, the shop felt quieter than before. The hum of the refrigerators sounded louder. Snow tapped softly against the windows outside. None of us had a joke ready. None of us tried to explain it away. We just sat there thinking about a storm, a set of lights that shouldn't exist, and a barrier that might have saved a life. To this day, I still remember the way she told it. Not dramatic, not like someone trying to scare us, just confused, unsettled, and certain of what she experienced. And sometimes when I pass an empty railroad crossing late at night, I think about her slamming on the brakes in a wall of snow, stopping inches from a train she couldn't see. And I wonder what would have happened if those lights hadn't appeared. The last time I went to New Orleans, I brought a couple of friends along because I wanted them to see the city the way I love it. Strange, layered, and full of stories that feel half history and half rumor. One of the stops I insisted on was the Marie Laveau Voodoo Museum. I've always been fascinated by the mythology around her. Even if you don't believe in any of it, you can't deny she left a mark on the city that still lingers in the air. The museum itself is small and cluttered, the kind of place where every inch of wall space is covered in artifacts, photos, candles, and handwritten notes from visitors. I thought it was charming in a chaotic way. Jessica, however, hated it. She didn't just dislike it quietly. She complained the entire time we were inside. She said it looked like a tourist trap, said it felt staged. He said she expected something grander and more authentic, whatever that meant. The more she talked, the more I felt like she was missing the point. The museum isn't supposed to be polished. It's supposed to feel dense and personal, like stepping into someone else's belief system. But Jessica was in a mood, and nothing was going to change that. When we finally stepped back out into the humid afternoon air, she kept going. We started walking back toward the Airbnb we had rented, weaving through narrow streets, past balconies dripping with plants, past musicians playing on corners. New Orleans always feels alive in a way that's hard to describe. Even the quiet streets feel like they're holding their breath between songs. Jessica was still ranting about how disappointing the museum was, replaying every detail she thought was dumb. My other friend and I mostly laughed it off and let her vent. It wasn't worth arguing over. We wandered without much direction and ended up in front of an old house with one of those historic plaques mounted beside the door. The building itself looked like so many others in the area. Aged wood, tall windows, the paint faded by decades of heat and storms. But the plaque caught my eye, so I stepped closer to read it. It explained that the house had belonged to Marie Laveau's father. I felt a little jolt of excitement at the coincidence. Out of all the streets we could have turned down, we ended up right there. I called the others over and pointed at the plaque. I expected at least mild interest, but Jessica rolled her eyes. She launched right back into her complaints, saying something like, "Great. Another overrated voodoo thing." She was holding her phone in her hand while she talked, gesturing casually the way people do when they're distracted. I was looking straight at her when it happened. Her phone flew out of her hand, not slipped, not dropped. It didn't tumble downward the way gravity would pull it. It shot sideways, like someone had slapped it out of her grip. It traveled a good 5 feet before it hit the pavement. The sound it made was sharp and ugly, the kind of crack that makes everyone around wince. For a split second, none of us moved. We just stared at the spot where it landed. Jessica looked stunned. Her hand was still half open in the position she'd been holding it. She kept saying, "I didn't throw it. I didn't throw it," over and over, like she was trying to convince herself. I replayed the moment in my head immediately. She hadn't tripped. Her feet were planted. Her arm hadn't jerked. There was no sudden motion that could explain the distance the phone traveled. It didn't arc like a fumble. It launched. We walked over to where it had landed, and the damage didn't look like a normal drop. I've seen plenty of cracked screens. This was different. The glass looked blown outward, spider-webbed in a way that suggested pressure from inside rather than impact from outside. Pieces were missing. The back casing had split. It honestly looked like the phone had burst. Jessica just stood there staring at it, her face drained of color. She kept repeating that it was brand new. She'd bought it less than a week before the trip. We tried to joke about it at first because that's what you do when something makes no sense. You look for humor so you don't have to sit in the discomfort. I said something about Marie Laveau not liking critics. My other friend laughed nervously. Jessica didn't laugh. She looked back at the house, then at the broken phone, then back at the house again. For the first time all day, she was quiet. There wasn't anyone close enough to have bumped her. The street wasn't crowded. No one brushed past us. No sudden gust of wind came through. It was one of those heavy, still afternoons where the air barely moves. The moment felt sealed off from everything else, like a tiny bubble where cause and effect had stopped behaving normally. We stood there longer than we should have, just staring. I remember feeling a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the same feeling you get when you realize you're being watched. I told myself it was just the weight of the story attached to the place. New Orleans is good at getting inside your head like that. The city feeds on suggestion. If you walk around thinking about ghosts and curses, every creak and shadow starts to feel meaningful. Eventually we picked up the pieces of the phone and started walking again. Jessica barely spoke the rest of the way back. She kept turning the broken device over in her hands like she expected it to explain itself. When we got to the apartment, she laid it on the table and just stared at it. The damage somehow looked worse under bright light. Tiny shards of glass clung to the edges. The screen was black, completely dead. That night the mood was different. The earlier energy of the trip had drained away. Even though none of us said it out loud, the incident hung over the room. We replayed it again and again, trying to force a rational explanation into place. Maybe her grip slipped and momentum did the rest. Maybe the battery malfunctioned at the exact moment it hit the ground. Maybe our memory of the distance was exaggerated by surprise. Every explanation sounded thin. Jessica eventually admitted the moment scared her, not in a horror movie way, but in a deeper, quieter way. She said it felt like she'd been corrected, like she'd crossed some invisible line by mocking something she didn't understand. I told her that was her brain looking for patterns, but I couldn't fully dismiss the feeling either. The timing was too perfect. The location was too specific. The violence of the break didn't match the fall. We stayed in New Orleans a few more days, and nothing else strange happened. The city returned to being loud and joyful and messy in the way it always is. Music spilled out of bars. People danced in the street. We ate too much and stayed out too late. But every now and then, I'd catch Jessica glancing at her replacement phone like she didn't entirely trust it. Even now, years later, that moment still sticks with me. I've seen people drop phones 1,000 times. I've dropped my own more than I care to admit. I've never seen one move like that. I've never seen one break like it was struck from the inside. Maybe there's a technical explanation buried somewhere in physics or manufacturing defects. Maybe it was just an absurd coincidence wrapped in the atmosphere of a city that thrives on legend. But when I picture that afternoon, I don't think about the museum or the walk or the heat. I see the phone leaving her hand in a straight, impossible line. I hear that crack against the pavement, and I remember the sudden silence that followed, like the street itself paused to watch. My friend's house burned down when we were younger. I don't mean a small kitchen fire or smoke damage. I mean the entire house was gone. One night it was standing there like it always had been, and the next day it was a black, hollow shell that smelled like wet ash and melted plastic. We were middle school kids, so the whole thing felt unreal. Fire trucks, neighbors standing in the street, his mom crying while wrapped in a blanket. Those are the images that stuck with me. His family was safe, which everyone kept repeating like a chant. But the shock of seeing a place we'd spent so much time reduced to rubble left a weird mark on all of us. For a while they bounced between relatives' houses until they found a rental directly across the street from where the burned house still stood. It was strange visiting him after that. But you could stand in his temporary front yard and look straight at the remains of his old life. Even months later, the smell lingered whenever it rained. The rental house itself wasn't bad, just older. It had creaky stairs, thin walls, and an unfinished basement that felt like it belonged to a completely different building. Bare concrete floor, exposed beams, a single hanging bulb that hummed when you turned it on. It was the kind of basement adults ignored, but kids immediately claimed. We decided it was perfect for skateboarding. We were at that age where any open space became a challenge. We dragged down an old ramp someone had built out of scrap wood, set up broken chairs as obstacles, and treated the basement like our personal skate park. The sound echoed like thunder every time wheels hit concrete. His parents didn't love it, but they also understood we needed something to burn off energy, and honestly, they were dealing with bigger things than a few loud kids in the basement. After everything his family had been through, normal chaos probably felt comforting. One night, a few of us were over there skating way later than we were supposed to. We lost track of time the way kids do when no adults are hovering. We'd skate, collapse laughing, argue about tricks, then try again. Eventually, we were too tired to stand. We left the boards scattered across the basement floor and went upstairs. The plan was to watch scary movies and crash in the living room. His parents and sister weren't home that night. If I remember right, they'd gone to stay with his grandparents. That gave the whole house a hollow, echoing quiet once we shut off the basement light. Upstairs, we piled blankets on the floor and put on whatever horror movie we could find. None of us were really watching by the end. It was background noise while we drifted towards sleep. The house had a different personality at night. Every tick and creak felt louder. Without adults moving around, the silence pressed in. Still, we were exhausted enough that it didn't matter. One by one, we started fading out. I was right on the edge of sleep when we heard it. The sound came from below us, from the basement. It wasn't subtle. It was a violent crash, like something heavy had been thrown as hard as possible onto concrete, the kind of impact that rattles through your chest. All of us snapped awake at the same time. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. We just stared at each other, eyes wide, listening for a follow-up noise. Nothing came, and the movie kept playing softly, which somehow made it worse. That normal background sound clashing with the shock of the crash made the moment feel wrong. One of my friends whispered that maybe something fell over. Another said maybe a board tipped. We all knew we'd left the basement messy. There were plenty of things that could have fallen, but the crash hadn't sounded like something tipping. It sounded deliberate, hard, like force behind it. Instead of doing the smart thing and staying put, we did what dumb middle school boys always do. We decided to investigate. We crept to the basement door together. The hallway felt longer than it had earlier. Every step made the floor complain. None of us wanted to be the one in front, so we bunched up awkwardly, shoving each other in nervous silence. When we reached the door, we just stood there staring at the knob. I remember my hand shaking when I reached for it. Not because I thought we'd see a ghost, but because something in my gut said we weren't supposed to open that door. I turned the knob anyway. The basement light was still on. We hadn't turned it off when we came upstairs. The bulb buzzed faintly, casting that weak yellow glow down the stairs. We leaned forward and peered into the space. At first, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. One of the skateboards was in the air. It wasn't spinning or falling, it was just there, floating maybe 3 feet off the ground, perfectly still. For a second, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, like the angle or the shadows were confusing depth. I blinked hard. It didn't change. The board hung in the same spot, nose slightly tilted, wheels facing us. Nobody spoke. We just stared. Time stretched in a way that's hard to explain. It couldn't have been more than a few seconds, but it felt long enough for my thoughts to race through every explanation and reject them all. There were no strings, no shelves, nothing it could be balanced on. The air in the basement felt heavy, like the room was holding its breath. Then the board dropped. It didn't drift down. It slammed into the concrete with explosive force. The crack echoed up the stairwell and punched the sound out of our chests. I flinched so hard, I stumbled back into the hallway. One of my friends swore loudly. Another actually made a choking noise like he forgot how to breathe. That was it. There was no discussion, no attempt to rationalize. Pure animal panic took over. We turned and ran. We didn't grab shoes. We didn't shut the door. We sprinted out of the house and across the street like something was chasing us. I remember the cold night air hitting my lungs and burning. We didn't stop until we reached my house. We pounded on the door until my parents opened it, half asleep and confused. We tried to explain, tripping over each other, words tangled with adrenaline. I'm sure we sounded insane. My parents chalked it up to imagination and fear feeding on itself. They let us crash in the living room anyway because we were so shaken we could barely stand still. None of us slept. Every time the house creaked, we jumped. We replayed the image of that board over and over in whispers, each retelling, making it feel more real instead of less. The next day we went back in daylight because daylight makes everything seem stupid and harmless. The basement looked normal. The skateboard lay on the floor where it had fallen. No damage beyond a fresh crack in the deck. We stood at the bottom of the stairs trying to recreate what we'd seen. Could it have bounced weird? Could it have been caught on something? Nothing we tried even came close to explaining how it had hung there in midair. His family moved out not long after. I don't know if our story had anything to do with it. Probably not. They were already planning to find a more permanent place. But after that night, none of us wanted to spend time in that basement again. Even during the day it felt different. The air seemed colder. Sounds carried strangely. We'd step down there, look around, and then come right back up without saying why. Years have passed, and I still replay that moment sometimes. I've tried to logic it to death. Memory is unreliable. Fear exaggerates. Maybe the board got wedged somehow, and we misunderstood what we saw in that split second. I know all the arguments. I've made them myself. But the image in my head is stubborn. A skateboard hanging in empty space. Silence thick enough to touch. Then the violent drop that snapped us out of whatever spell we were under. We avoid that house when we're back in the neighborhood. It's just another rental with new tenants who probably have no idea what a bunch of kids once saw in their basement. Every time I pass it, I feel that same tightness in my chest I felt at the top of those stairs. Not terror exactly, more like respect. Like there are moments in life that don't fit neatly into explanation, and your brain keeps whirring at them like a loose thread. I don't claim it was a ghost or a curse or anything dramatic. I just know what we saw. A group of tired, loud, skeptical kids all saw the same impossible thing at the same time. And sometimes, late at night when a noise wakes me up and the house is too quiet, I think about that floating board and how the world felt tilted for those few seconds. It's a small memory, but it sits in the dark corner of my mind, patient and unchanged, waiting to be remembered. I used to work as a night security guard on a college campus that had once been a military fort going all the way back to the Revolution. The place carried its history in a heavy way. Even after centuries of renovations, you could still see the bones of what it used to be. Thick brick walls, concrete bunkers half swallowed by earth, artillery placements tucked into hills like sleeping animals. During World War II, it had been packed with soldiers and equipment. By the time I worked there, all of it had been converted into classrooms, dorms, and offices, but the atmosphere never really left. My shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. After midnight, the last co-worker clocked out and drove off, and the entire campus belonged to me. No traffic, no chatter, just wind and old buildings settling into the night. My job sounded simple: make sure doors were locked, lights were off, and chase away anyone trying to sneak into the bunkers to drink or smoke. Most nights were quiet, the kind of quiet where your own footsteps start sounding too loud. There was one building everyone warned me about when I started, the hotel training building. Students used it to learn hospitality and bartending, but after dark it was usually empty. Even during the day it had a strange stillness to it, like the air didn't move the same way as the rest of campus. The older staff called it haunted with a casual certainty, the way you talk about bad weather that always comes back. The first time I did a full patrol through it, I didn't expect anything. I walked room to room, turning off lights, checking doors, clearing floors. Everything was normal. I finished, stepped outside, wrote a quick note on my clipboard, and continued my route. About an hour later, I circled back. A light was on upstairs. I remember staring at the windows from outside, convinced I had just missed it earlier, annoyed at myself more than anything. I went back in, climbed the stairs, and found a single hallway light glowing at the far end. No sound, no movement. I shut it off again, checked every room twice, and left. It happened again the next night, and the night after that. Lights turning on in areas I had already cleared. Always small things. Never dramatic, just enough to chip at your nerves. I started taking photos of the switches with my phone after I turned them off, like I needed proof for myself that I wasn't getting sloppy. Sometimes I would stand in the lobby after finishing a sweep, just listening. The building had a big open space that carried sound in a strange way. One night, while I was leaning against the desk, I heard footsteps above me, slow, deliberate pacing across the floor. I radioed a call to an empty channel out of habit and headed upstairs expecting to catch a student who'd snuck in. The floor was empty. Every room locked. No open windows. No place to hide. When I went back down, the pacing started again, directly above me. I stood frozen in the center of the lobby, staring at the ceiling like I could force an explanation out of it. The steps continued for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped all at once. Another night, I heard what sounded like a chain dragging across the floor overhead. A long metallic scrape that raised the hair on my arms. It echoed through the building, followed by what I can only describe as a distant scream. Not loud, not close, just there. I ran upstairs that time. I didn't even think about it. Adrenaline took over. The floor was empty again, silent, dust undisturbed. The one time I had another officer with me, I was relieved just to have someone to talk to. We were standing in the lobby making small talk when the air changed. The temperature dropped so suddenly it felt like walking into a freezer. We both stopped mid-sentence. You could see our breath. Then we heard it. A little girl giggling. It was soft and playful, like it came from right behind us. We turned at the same time. Nobody there. The sound didn't echo like a normal noise in that building. It felt contained, like it had been placed in the air. My co-worker just stared at me with wide eyes. Neither of us tried to joke about it. We finished the patrol together and stayed a little closer to each other than we needed to. The basement was worse. The conference room down there had a wide open space with support columns that created deep pockets of shadow. More than once I saw shapes dart across the room from the corner of my eye. Fast, human-sized movement that vanished the second I looked directly at it. I got in the habit of announcing myself out loud before entering, like I was walking into an occupied room. The moment that really got to me happened near the end of a shift. I was in the lobby again, tired, just wanting the night to be over. I glanced up at the staircase leading to the second floor. I saw a woman's legs, black shoes, pale calves. The lower half of a figure walking calmly from right to left across the upper hallway. I watched her take 2 steps and pass straight through a solid wall. No hesitation, no distortion. She just continued walking and vanished. I didn't chase it. I didn't call out. Something in me shut down and went very quiet. I finished the minimum checks I had to do and stayed outside the rest of the night. There were stories attached to that building, of course. People said it used to be officers' quarters. An officer supposedly died there during a flu outbreak around World War II. Older rumors claimed a man accused of spying was executed on the grounds during the Revolution. I never tried too hard to verify any of it. After a while, the stories felt less important than the experiences, and the hotel wasn't even the only place. The old hospital basement carried voices that didn't belong to anyone, whispering that faded when you tried to focus on it. In the colonial graveyard at the center of campus, I sometimes saw shapes moving between the stones when I knew I was alone. Footsteps would fall in rhythm with mine in dark stretches of path, stopping the instant I stopped. Faces seemed to peer from the bunker ruins until I shined a light and found nothing but cracked concrete and weeds. Strangely, fear wasn't the only feeling that place gave me. There was a pull to it, a sense of standing in layers of time that hadn't fully settled. Every building felt occupied by memories that refused to leave. Some nights I dreaded my rounds. Other nights I felt like I was walking through a museum that only opened after midnight. I eventually moved on to a different job, as somewhere bright and modern and completely ordinary. But every once in a while I catch myself missing those silent patrols. The wind through old trees, the echo of my boots in empty halls, the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I looked. It was unsettling, sure, but it was also unforgettable. And in a strange way, I'm glad I got to walk those halls when the rest of the world was asleep. I was sitting alone in the den when it happened. It wasn't late enough for the house to feel completely asleep, but it was quiet in that way it gets when you're the only one home. No TV on, no music, no background noise at all. Just the low hum of the house settling around me. I remember feeling relaxed, almost comfortable in the silence, like I finally had the space to breathe. Then I heard a man's voice. Hello? It wasn't muffled or distant. It sounded clear, like it was coming from somewhere inside the house, close enough that I could hear the tone and shape of the word. I froze immediately, my body locking up before my mind could catch up. A second later, the voice came again. Hello? This time it was louder, more deliberate, like whoever it was expected an answer. My first thought was that I had imagined it. When you're alone long enough, your brain can play tricks on you. But the sound had been too clear, too human, and too close for me to dismiss it that easily. I sat there, barely breathing, listening as hard as I could. The den suddenly felt smaller, like the walls had crept in while I wasn't looking. I knew for a fact that I had locked both the front door and the back door earlier. I always double-checked. It was a habit I'd picked up over time, especially when I was alone. Lock the door, check it once, then check it again, just to be sure. I could picture myself doing it, my hand on the lock, that solid click when it slid into place. There was no doubt in my mind. That knowledge didn't make me feel better. It made everything worse, because if the doors were locked, then the voice had no business being inside. I stayed seated for a few seconds, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was shaking my chest. Every part of me screamed to stay where I was, to stay quiet, to not draw attention to myself. But another part of me needed answers, needed to know where the voice came from, needed to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. Slowly, I stood up. The sound of my own movement felt unbearably loud. The floor creaked under my feet, and I flinched at the noise, half expecting someone to answer me from somewhere in the house. I didn't call out. I didn't say anything back. I just stood there, listening again. Nothing. The silence had returned, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt watched. The stairs were just beyond the den, leading up and away from where I was standing. I stared at them for a long moment, trying to decide what to do. The voice had sounded like it came from that direction, or maybe from behind me. It was hard to tell. Sound behaves strangely in a quiet house. My fear didn't disappear, but curiosity pushed me forward anyway. I moved slowly toward the stairs, each step careful, like I was afraid the house itself might react if I moved too quickly. My hand brushed the wall as I climbed, grounding myself, reminding myself that this was real, that I was awake. Halfway up, I stopped. I listened again. Still nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no doors opening or closing. Just the same thick silence pressing in from all sides. I continued up the stairs, my pulse loud in my ears, until I reached the top. From there, I could see down the hallway that led toward the back of the house. That's when I saw it. The back door was wide open, not cracked, not unlocked and closed. Wide open, as if someone had walked through it without hesitation. Cold air drifted in from outside, carrying that unfamiliar outdoor smell that never belongs inside a house. The sight of it sent a wave of fear through me so strong I felt dizzy. My stomach dropped. I knew I had locked that door. I knew it. I hadn't imagined it. I hadn't forgotten. I could remember the exact moment I turned the lock, the sound it made, the way I tugged on the handle afterward to be sure. And yet there it was, standing open, exposing the house to the dark outside. I didn't step any closer. Every instinct told me not to. The doorway felt wrong, like it was an open mouth waiting to swallow something. I stood there at the top of the stairs, staring at it, trying to convince myself there was a normal explanation. Maybe I had unlocked it without realizing. Maybe someone else had come home earlier and left again. But none of those explanations fit. No one else had keys. No one had any reason to be there. And even if someone had come in, why call out, "Hello?" like that? Why say it twice? Why disappear without a sound? I scanned the rest of the house from where I stood. Every other door was closed. Everything else looked exactly the way it should. There was no sign of anyone else being there. No movement, no shadows. Just that open door, silently proving that something was very wrong. I backed away slowly. I didn't run. Running felt like a mistake, like it would somehow invite attention. I moved carefully, my eyes never leaving the hallway, my body tense and ready to bolt if I needed to. Once I was back downstairs, I locked myself in the den again, pushing furniture closer to the door even though I knew it wouldn't really stop anything. I didn't sleep that night. Every small sound made me jump. The house creaked and groaned like it always does, but now each noise felt intentional, like it meant something. I replayed the voice over and over in my head, the way it sounded calm, casual, almost curious, not aggressive, not panicked, just there. Hello? Hello? The next night wasn't any better. Even though nothing else happened, the fear didn't fade. It lingered, sitting heavy in my chest, making it impossible to relax. I checked the locks over and over again, sometimes every few minutes. I barely slept, and when I did, it was shallow and restless, filled with half-dreams and sudden jolts awake. What scared me the most wasn't just that someone might have been inside the house. It was that they had called out. They weren't sneaking. They weren't hiding. They announced themselves as if they expected an answer, as if they were testing whether anyone was there. And when they didn't get a response, they left just as quietly as they came. To this day, I don't know who that voice belonged to or how the door ended up open. I just know that for 2 nights afterward, sleep felt impossible, and the house never felt quite the same again. Once you hear a stranger's voice inside a place that's supposed to be safe, that sense of safety doesn't come back easily. And sometimes, when the house is quiet, I still think about that voice echoing through the den, calling out into the silence, waiting for someone to answer. After my dad died, My head was a mess in a way I didn't really have words for at the time. Grief felt less like sadness and more like pressure. Everything in my life felt loud, crowded, and unreal. I kept hearing his voice in my memory, kept replaying the last conversations we had, and I couldn't stand being around people for very long. I needed space. I needed quiet. He used to tell me when I was a kid that ghosts weren't the things to fear. It was the living you had to watch out for, because they were the ones who could actually hurt you. That line stuck with me in a strange way after he was gone. My parents owned a cabin in Oregon near Mount Bachelor. After my dad took his life, the finances fell apart. My mom couldn't keep up with the payments, and renting it out wasn't covering the cost anymore. The cabin was about to go on the market. For one final month, it sat empty while paperwork was being finalized. I saw that empty stretch of time as an escape hatch. I quit my job without thinking too hard about it, packed my snowboard gear, grabbed my dog Midnight, and drove up there in my dad's car, the one he'd left to me. It felt like I was borrowing a piece of him for the trip. The cabin had always been a rental when we weren't using it, so I had keys and the alarm code. I didn't bother telling the rental company I was staying. I just wanted to disappear for a while. The drive up was quiet, except for the hum of the engine and Midnight shifting around in the back seat. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the air smelled like cold wood and old smoke from the fireplace. It felt like stepping into a paused memory. The first 2 days were peaceful in a way I hadn't felt since before my dad died. I played in the snow with Midnight until we were both exhausted. I spent hours on the slopes, letting the cold air burn my lungs and clear my head. At night I drank on the balcony, smoked cigarettes, played PlayStation, and watched DVDs until I fell asleep. I had stocked up on food and booze before arriving, so I barely left the property. It was just me, my dog, and the snow. For the first time in months, the noise in my head started to quiet down. The cabin itself was simple. The bottom floor held a small living room, a kitchen, and a guest bedroom I never used. Upstairs were 2 more rooms and a master bedroom with a balcony overlooking the trees. I stuck to the main spaces and kept the doors to the unused rooms shut. Open doors leading into dark rooms always unsettled me. I liked knowing exactly where the shadows were. On the 3rd day, heavy snow pinned us inside. The flakes came down thick and steady, turning the world outside into a white blur. I didn't feel like driving anywhere, so I stayed in. Around midday, I took Midnight outside to let him run. That's when I noticed the footprints. They circled part of the cabin and trailed off toward the dense trees. The snow was still falling, but the prints looked fresh, like someone had walked there not long before I stepped outside. We were isolated. Only 2 other cabins sat nearby, each about a block away, and I knew they were empty. Everything else was forest stretching for miles. I stood there staring at the tracks, trying to judge their direction. They didn't lead to my door. They didn't come from the road, they just appeared near the cabin and vanished into the woods. I told myself someone must be staying nearby and wandering around, maybe another shut-in like me. The explanation felt thin, but I didn't want to stand in the cold inventing stories, so I went back inside and let it go. That night, Midnight was stretched out beside me on the bed when his ears snapped upright. His whole body went alert in an instant. Before I could react, he jumped down and bolted downstairs. I stayed frozen, listening. I could hear him pacing in the living room, claws clicking against the floor, moving back and forth like he was tracking something I couldn't see. After about 5 minutes, he charged back upstairs and started his frantic little dance that meant he wanted outside. I swore under my breath, pulled on my boots. Me unclipped on his leash. The moment we stepped out into the driveway, he didn't pee. He strained forward, dragging against the leash, staring into the same dark section of trees where I'd seen the footprints earlier. He sniffed along the side of the house, then looked up at the roof, whining low in his throat. When I refused to follow him toward the trees, he planted himself and just stared into the darkness, muscles tight. The forest felt wrong, too quiet. I didn't want to test anything that might be out there, so I hauled him back inside and locked the door. About half an hour later, lying in bed, I heard footsteps above me, not scurrying, not sliding snow. Distinct impacts, spaced like a person walking across the roof. 6 steps, maybe 7, each one deliberate. I held my breath. Midnight heard it too. He shot toward the balcony door and barked, expecting me to open it. I tried to reason it out. Pine cone falling, branch shifting, some animal crossing the roof. But the spacing was wrong. It sounded like a stride. Adrenaline overrode fear. I grabbed my coat, shoes, flashlight and cigarettes and stepped onto the balcony. The cold air slapped me awake. I lit a cigarette with shaking hands and swept the beam of the flashlight across the roof. The snow was smooth and untouched. No tracks, no dents, nothing. I stood there longer than I should have, letting my eyes adjust. The trees rose like black pillars around the cabin. As the darkness settled into focus, I noticed a shape in one of them. A tree about 20 feet from the balcony, slightly taller than the roofline. Something was crouched between 2 branches. At first my brain refused to name it. It looked like a man squatting low, feet planted on one branch, arms stretched overhead gripping another. The proportions were wrong, too still, too deliberate. My cigarette burned down between my fingers and I didn't feel it. I just stared. Midnight stood behind me, pacing and giving small, uncertain barks. The figure didn't move. It didn't sway with the wind. It didn't adjust its grip. It just watched. I could feel it watching even though I couldn't see a face. Every instinct I had screamed not to shine the flashlight directly on it, not to acknowledge it in any way. Slowly, without turning my back, I stepped inside and pulled Midnight with me. I locked the door, heart hammering so hard it hurt. Only once I was inside did I swing the flashlight toward the tree through the glass. The branch was empty, nothing there. I shut the curtains with shaking hands and climbed back into bed, trying to convince myself I'd misread shadows, and grief and isolation had twisted my perception. Then the tapping started. Light, rhythmic taps on the balcony door, like fingertips drumming on glass. It didn't stop. It kept going, patient and steady, for what felt like forever. Midnight sat stiff at the foot of the bed, staring at the door but refusing to go near it. The air in the room felt thick. I had the overwhelming sensation that whatever was outside wanted me to open the door. Not violently, not aggressively, just inviting, waiting. And underneath that pull, I heard my dad's voice in my head as clear as if he were standing beside the bed. Stay put. Don't open it. Fear the living. I lay there sweating, my eyes locked on the curtains, listening to that tapping and clinging to the memory of his voice like it was a rope. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me under. When I woke up, sunlight filled the room and the world looked ordinary again. The balcony was empty. The snow outside was smooth except for the marks Midnight and I had made the night before. Nothing else happened during the rest of my stay. The forest returned to its normal quiet. Midnight acted like himself again. I finished the week and drove home carrying the whole experience like a splinter I couldn't remove. Even now, years later, I don't know what to do with that memory. Maybe grief and isolation bent my mind into seeing something that wasn't there. Maybe stress built a shape out of shadows and fear. I'm willing to admit how fragile the human brain can be. But the sound of those footsteps, the tapping on the glass, and the certainty of being watched still sit in my chest like a stone. I have a family now, a wife, 2 kids, a full life that's warm and loud and real. And yet sometimes, when the house is dark and quiet, I catch myself listening for soft taps at the window and remembering the night I chose not to open a door. The story ends here. If this one stayed with you, please leave a comment. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe so you are here for the next one. Until then, stay safe.